All right, welcome everybody to the October 26th special edition of Kubernetes SIG Service Catalog. Today, we are going to try to mine Jason's pull request to the incubator repo for the kernel of use cases that we can all agree upon. So Jason, would you mind sharing your screen with that pull request on there, and we can go through those?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it's probably, is that big enough?
I think so. So what I suggest for this is we have a copy of this. Why don't we try to go through these, and we'll take out, why don't we take out anything that we don't immediately agree to, just for the sake of getting the minimal set of things that we all agree to into the Git repo. Is everybody cool with that? All right, I'm not hearing no's. Okay, Jason, do you wanna lead this part of it?
Sure.
Okay. I'm sorry to put you on the spot. If you don't, I'm happy to, but I think maybe it's better if we don't just continually hear the grating sound of my voice.
Oh man, all that espresso went to waste. All right, start at the top. It's a very good place to start. I guess before we start, does anyone have questions about the organization of this thing? Why we kind of did it this way to make sense? All right, catalog management. So as a user, I want to be able to register a broker with the Kubernetes Service Catalog so that the catalog is aware of the services the broker offers. Any objections? Seems straightforward. Want to be able to update a registered broker so that the catalog can maintain the most recent versions of services that broker offers. As a user, I want to be able to delete a broker from the catalog so that I can keep the catalog clean of brokers I no longer want to support. And then I think these are the first two where there was a pretty lively discussion on GitHub about importing and exporting brokers.
Yeah, so I think these use cases came from you, Weston. Is that right, originally?
Yeah, and I made some comments. I was just trying to think through the local development story a little bit and try to make sure that we have a way for, I don't know, somebody that's a part of a team to bootstrap their environment with a set of services so that their first task is not going and registering 18 different service brokers that their team happens to use. But I do think that it's probably something that we can push out for now. I guess I briefly brainstormed about this, and if the brokers are registered with the controller via some sort of YAML file, then that seems like a pretty easy way for me to sort of export, import, just create kubectl create, -f and then a pointer off to the list of service brokers. Seems like a reasonable way to bootstrap an environment with a single command.
Yeah, so that's sort of what was in my head too. So as you mentioned, there's kubectl create -f that will take a single file that has a bunch of different resources in them and just create them in the API server. And there's also kubectl export, which will give you the exportable version of something. Like it'll take out the status part of a pod and other status fields that aren't going to be portable across API servers. So I think these use cases align pretty well with that, and I think that we will get that. Well, so this is an interesting area of the intersection between kubectl and the main API server and this thing. I want to say that if we build the catalog correctly, we should be able to find a way to get those things by virtue of how the catalog is architected if we reuse the API server bits from the core. Anyway, since we are talking about since we're trying to forge consensus, does anybody feel that these use cases are invalid, or can we call this whole first catalog management section a go from the standpoint of we agree they're valid use cases?
So the last one we were just talking about, I agree it's a valid use case. I'm not quite sure it's as simple as just take the YAML file from one place and stick it into another, because you have to build up a trust relationship. There's accounting, there's procurement, there's money involved in many cases. So I think it's a lot more involved in it, but I do agree with the use case. I would just prefer if we rephrase it slightly differently. And I did propose some alternative text, which I think covers the use case without necessarily assuming a solution.
Okay, so the rubric that we put down is if there's any dissent, we can strike it and handle it later. So why don't we go ahead and strike which lines, Doug?
Well, I'm not actually suggesting we strike it as much as if Weston's okay with my alternative text, then I think we're in agreement. I just didn't want to assume an answer of import-export as opposed to something else.
I have it. Yeah, that's fine. We can change the import-export terminology. I haven't reviewed this specific text that you proposed, but I can take a look at that. But I'm fine altering this to be a little bit more generic.
Okay, so the next several lines are, the next lines down to 49 are carried over from, these are more detailed write-ups of the first three use cases in here that are carried over from work that Doug and I did in this use case document a few weeks ago, really. I think they're that old, so there's probably not a need to go over them now. Why don't we skip ahead to the next section, unless I think I heard someone start to speak.
I had a few just sort of process questions. Is there a doc that we're sort of that we can collaborate on to list all these open questions and try to resolve them? Do we have anything like that checked into the repo?
So I think the right process to do that is to create GitHub issues for specific questions.
So use an issue. All right, that's fair.
Cool.
Another option is wiki page in the repo, which is, and issues are great for deep dives on specific things, but if we want to accumulate a body of things that we need to work on and keep that up to date, GitHub issues have proven difficult to manage, although there is the new projects mechanism that you can use to organize and stack rank issues, and we could try to use that. But the main complaint people have had about using issues and labels is that it's sort of really hard to figure out what's current, what's done, what the priorities are, and things like that. So I don't really care too much about what mechanism, but that's just the feedback that we've received in other areas of the project.
Okay. Yeah, and I expect that that we'll probably work through some different iterations of how to collaborate. To me, like, I'm agnostic. I would be happy to see wiki or GitHub issues, anything to get the discussion into GitHub.
And so I'll leave it to you to kind of define what you would like to have us do. But another point of feedback I had was when reading through this, even when you get to the first use case, it talks a lot about brokers and catalogs. And I know we have that terminology list, but for someone coming at this pretty new, it's a little, we're already making some assumptions like, oh, there is a broker and a broker has a set of catalogs that have a set of service types and, you know, you can create them in these ways. Mm-hmm. I don't know the best way to capture that, but some sort of intro I thought would be pretty useful to just sort of set the groundwork for what we expect these different pieces to be. And I don't know if that's the definition or if it should just be like at the very top of this doc, which is like, hey, read this other thing over here, just to get up to speed before reading through the use cases.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I think that the story that Jay posted as a pull request, like that kind of format, is probably a good way for someone that's totally new to the space to kind of get a handle on what the nouns and verbs in the space are. I would like to see that story land in the repo and be the thing that you can read to start from zero, and at the end you feel like you understand you understand enough about the problem space that you can read the more like tersely worded use cases. My own personal opinion. I'm happy to hear other ideas.
That feels like a glossary. We've started some of that in PR 15. There are a few nouns there. It definitely needs to be fleshed out. I think we can.
Okay, I just wanted to kind of offer that feedback.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I mean, they're all named service in varying forms, so I don't see why you got a problem with that.
Yeah, it's so hard.
Which definition of service?
You can't be wrong if you just call it a service, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so noted that we need to. I think there's room for both a glossary and an introductory story to explain the basics in kind of a English prose. I think Jay, you put it as creative writing 101 type of format. I think there's room for both, and let's continue refining those this week and next. Asynchronously on GitHub?
Sounds good.
Okay. Let's see. So, catalog publishing.
Yeah. Let's see. Where's my cursor? There it is. So, how are services identified? By name, service name and ID, plan name and ID. I think that's one of those open questions worth discussion. Who can see which services, and these are, and who can see which service instances are globally visible. From the catalog curation standpoint, which broker-provided services are globally visible, which namespaces can see which catalog services, and then the catalog listing the service types and instances as an open question.
Yeah, so I don't think that these are invalid. I do think from prior experience in Kubernetes that it can be easier to forego questions about ACLs, policy, RBAC, et cetera, and concentrate on the core mechanics first, and then worry about the questions of the types that I just mentioned. The caveat is that you have to build a thing. If you do that, you have to build a thing that you can eventually implement policy for and implement RBAC over. So I am personally okay with these staying in. I think it may be convenient to table them, keep them in there, but table them and concentrate on the core mechanics. And that's what I've got on that piece, EOF.
Yeah, speaking of core mechanics, I think Doug wrote something, is like, should the catalog have service classes or service types only? Or should it be a combo of service types and service instances? Because it's like, who can see which service instances? Are those exposed through the catalog, or are they exposed through some other mechanism? And I think Doug was advocating for keeping those concepts separate. The catalog is just a collection of service types that you can offer.
Yeah, I agree. There's some discussion that needs to happen to nail that down. As far as like this list of questions, do we think any of these in the section that we just went over are invalid, or can we safely commit these and work through them after that?
They seem fine. Just one quick question on the, what is it, fourth or fifth one? It says, which broker-provided services are globally visible? The fact that you put the phrase broker provided, does that mean anything, or is that just because you're just extra typey?
I think that was to indicate that those are the thing that we sometimes call service types that in the DAIS proposal are called service classes, just to provide some contextual disambiguation of which thing named as services is that referring to, really.
Is that different than the services on the second bullet?
No, I think.
So the second and third bullets, Jason and I attempted to go and refine 45 or 44 and 45. So they're similar. I'm totally fine striking some of them, and if we feel that there's a facet that needs to be explored that isn't present after that, it's easy to add them later.
Because the 52 and 53 look like duplicates of 54 and 55. That's why I was a little confused.
Yeah. And 56, I think. So, yeah, I think we just nuke these. They are redundant.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
I think one sort of meta point that suggests is we need to be careful about terminology. It's come up a few times in this discussion. So we should just agree to use the terms in the glossary. The word service should never be used without qualification. And, introducing new terms like broker provided services, we should just try to avoid that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So why don't we amend the bylaws of this meeting and say that we'll merge the product of this out of this meeting, and then we'll take a pass through. We'll find one or more people to take a pass through and reify all the terminology in the glossary in this document so that it's consistent with that glossary. Is everybody cool with that?
Yeah.
All right. So let's see.
I think 54 is covered as well in the context of who can see which services.
I think you're right. Yeah. Strike it.
And then 54 speaks to the catalog containing only service types and not necessarily service instances, which doesn't mean that the service instances aren't themselves discoverable, but would not be part of the catalog.
Yeah.
That'd be like a fair characterization.
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is really more of an open question than a use case so much, but in the name of expediency, I think it's fine to leave it in there.
Okay.
And we'll work through it.
Okay. All right. So requesting services. So this is a consumer who would like to get access to a service. The first one is, how do I ask for a new service from the catalog? And the second one is, how do I bind an application to an existing service instance? So something that has already been provisioned.
And just the first one is ask for a new service. That is, how do I create a new service instance from a service?
Sorry, run that by me again.
When it says, how do I ask for a new service, could maybe a better way to phrase that would be to say, how do I create a service instance from a service or for a particular service from the catalog instead of ask?
Great. Yep.
Yeah, I think my only other feedback for these use cases is the term user is pretty generic. And if we could kind of agree on a set of actors, I think we've all said consumer is one, service provider / operator is another, and just use those nouns to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I think that it's a good point, and that should hopefully come out of the glossary creation as we extract nouns into a bag of nouns. So let's see. So we've got creating something, getting access to something that already exists. And then this last one, how does the catalog support multiple consumers in different Kubernetes namespace of the same instance of a service? So I'm in namespace A, they're in namespace B, and we've got a shared service that we would like to both bind to. Reasonable.
Yeah, so I am not positive whether this will remain a valid use case, but it is a question that we need to explore. So I'm fine leaving this in for now.
Cool. Anything around requesting services that Peter Villick is missing?
I
Instead of
think. Go ahead, Svile.
Oh, I was just thinking that instead of saying requesting services, maybe it's creating services or something, because requesting is funny because it could be like requesting the status of the service or things like that.
Yeah. I think
But
that's
English is my second language, so take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, so I think the reason that I feel request is appropriate is that I'm probably hinting toward a claim-based thing where you aren't necessarily creating the service instance yourself, but it is going to be done on behalf of the request or the claim or the token.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's yeah. If everybody's fine, I'm just trying to think if there's maybe a little bit of a more specific term like provisioning or whatever.
You mean like the next
something that is already by what's that?
You mean like the next paragraph down, which says provisioning is
Well, kind of like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and we could say something like, how do I cause a new service instance to be created?
To be created.
So, I mean, it's a little bit cumbersome, but yeah, it seems a little bit more clear.
Okay. Okay, so I think the only other thing that I think might be worth discussing here is as someone who's requested a service be created, as a user, how do I know that my service request has been fulfilled?
I think that is a valid one.
My only concern with that is that that's probably true of every single action the user takes. I'm wondering whether that's just more of an implementation detail.
Yeah, I think it may not become it may not stay a use case, but this document isn't straight up use cases. It's kind of a mixture of use cases / important open questions. So I'm fine with it being in the document for now.
Okay, that's fine.
That
Just throw the word instance or after the word service throughout that.
right, service. Cool. Provisioning a service instance, and this is where we bring in another one of the personas. So as a broker operator, I want to control the number of instances of my service so that I can control resource footprint, control the resource footprint of my service. So Pi, how do you feel about the quotaing at this stage of the game?
I think this is valid to ask. This is another area, like besides policy, that is definitely good to think about. But I'm not certain. I think it might be useful to keep it in mind, set it to the side, because like policy, ACL, quota are all like fairly detailed subject matter facets of their own. So this is another one that might be easier to explore after we feel like we've got the core mechanics down.
So 73 and 75, I think these are both have more to do with provisioning a set of things in the Kubernetes cluster, which will provide the service, less so than something that is living off cluster and perhaps fronted by a Cloud Foundry service broker. So as an implementer of a service provider or service backend, again, I think this is a noun to extract on Kubernetes. Where may I provision Kubernetes resources so that I may provide the requested service? And paired with that, as an implementer, what credentials should I use to provision those Kubernetes resources so that I may provide the requested service?
I personally think these are valid to ask.
I'll just point out that gets into gray box territory, away from black box.
Yeah, I was going to say, where's the line for sort of phase one of this work? Are we sticking with Blackbox or not?
I think so. Let me say, one, I think Blackbox is a convenient line to draw now. I do think that provision in line 73 may refer more to the black box case of where do I put the secret that I need to use a black box service than where do I put white box resources. Jason, I don't know if you understand it that way.
I don't think so. It's not under the right category for that, I don't think. That would be under binding, right?
Yeah, I
Yes,
think
you're
we've got
right.
secret creation down further. Yeah, this definitely is the gray box. I think we can strike it for now.
I say strike it then under the rules that we agreed to.
And maybe we should have a dumping ground for all the things we're deferring, so we don't have to like rethink them.
Yeah, we have this captured in Git, then we could do a diff later.
So I'm not sure where this goes or even if it goes anyplace, but at some point, I think we need to have a concrete decision as terms of the interface between the platform and the service broker. And is Cloud Foundry Service Broker APIs the starting point for that? I've been kind of assuming it was at least my starting point. But I want to make sure everybody else is on the same page, because otherwise we're going to be disagreeing without necessarily realizing it, put it that way.
I also think that's a good starting point, and it's a fairly good black box model.
Okay.
So I agree with Doug.
So maybe we should call that out someplace and say that's our starting point for the interface between the platform and the service provider.
I think also it's a great idea, and it would be useful to go and start with something like that, and then drive any changes through the venues that we already have in place for any necessary changes like schemas or whatever.
Yep, agreed.
All right. I could stick language in there somewhere. CF as the I'll turn that to something a little more coherent later. Binding to a service instance as a broker operator, I want to control the number of bindings to a service instance so that I may provide limits. So free plan with 3 bindings.
They're coming to take me away. Now, if you know what song that refers to, you are far too old.
Ho ho, ha ha, hee hee.
There you go.
Life is happening. So again, this control the number of bindings.
Yeah, that's quota domain, I think. We can leave it in there for now.
All right. As a user of service instance, I want a predictable set of Kubernetes resources, secrets, or config map created after binding so that I know how to configure my application to use the service instance.
Makes sense to me.
Oh, I thought people were going to have feels on this one. All right.
I think either at least having a predictable set of resources and names for those resources, and potentially even being able to configure the names of those resources is important for the declarative model to work.
Yeah.
I don't want someone to have to write a programmatic client to create something, go fetch UIDs and things like that, and then generate the next set of resources to consume them.
Yeah, so predictable to me means that you can use something like generate name or supply a set of names to use.
Generate name is not predictable.
Yes, you are right.
So just so you know, Jason, the reason I'm okay with that is because all it says is we want to define what people should expect. And I'm not saying I agree or disagree with what's there, but I agree that we need to have a predictable set of output.
Cool. As a service operator, I want to be able to discover what applications are bound to services I am responsible for so that I may operate the service properly.
By this, do you mean the service operator queries itself or it queries the platform?
I also am not understanding this one now, looking at it again.
Yeah. So I think when we were talking about it yesterday, it was all around who's bound to what, and being able to answer that question. Again, I think this is something that we discussed is falling out of the implementation of the Kubernetes resource. So we can just strike this.
Well, I wouldn't look. I think the idea of someone on the Kubernetes side of things, being on the platform side of things, being able to find out who or what is bound to a particular service instance is a valid query in general. I just wasn't sure that it would be the service operator because I'm interpreting the service operator as the service provider.
I think this might be more of a catalog operator use case.
I would actually think of it more as a user who, someone who's within the scope of the namespace. Before they delete a service instance, they want to know if anybody's using it.
I think there are two different, at least, personas that may be interested in this, right? Like a user, an application operator wants to know which services their application is bound to. An administrator may want to know all of the bindings from all applications to all services. And there's probably some middle ground in there too that I'm not thinking of.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I just want to make sure we don't ignore the fact that it's not just a catalog guy. It's also a user in the namespace who can create and delete instances.
Can we turn 84 into catalog operator and then add a new one on 87? That is, as a user, I want to see which services my applications are bound to.
That work for you, Paul?
Yep.
Okey-doke.
All right.
So using and consuming a service instance. So this is after the binding, and then from the application, then reading the things that it needs to connect. So what is the unit of consumption of a service name, space, pod, something else? This was just copied over from the previous set of issues.
Yeah. So I think there are two different levels here. I think that the level of making a claim is probably in namespace, and there's a different level for binding that could be of course the name is escaping me. The thing that we now call pet set, pet set or deployment. That is the target of a binding.
Sorry, this question is directed at me. My attention was diverted. This is the thread on the email list.
Yes.
Yes, and I think that I think the email captures this quite well. Can be copy paste.
Yes.
Brian, will you license the content of your email to us?
Yes. If it saves me from having to write it again, please do it.
Okay. Okay, so we'll call that one seeded from the email Brian wrote.
I'm just.
Yeah. Let's see.
And I think I just want to make sure I understand it. If I can take 1 minute to go and say how I understood it, which is there is some kind of a container object. Let's call it service binding instance or something like that, and it has a label selector. And the label selector is the one that defines the units that the consumption is tied to.
I think that is probably more specific than is productive to talk about now, but I don't feel that that is terribly off the mark. I think there are probably...
Fundamentally, it's going to be some set of pods within a namespace is the short answer.
Yes.
And the manual way of connecting them would be to have some reference to the pods that consume the predictable secret information, the automagic way that can automatically inject that information and set up network policy and things like that would use a label selector on some resource like service instance binding or service instance claim or whatever it is we decide to call it.
Perfect.
So, Brian, just for my own understanding in terms of moving forward, are we assuming that we can or cannot change existing Kubernetes code in our final solution? Because a lot of what you described there implies sort of not, I want to say magic happens under the covers, in terms of things appearing within your pod, but that would require changing existing code. I was wondering whether that's okay or not, because I've been kind of assuming we weren't allowed to change existing code.
We are allowed to change existing code. I would prefer that changes to existing code not be only usable for this mechanism. And most of the things that we would need other extensions or automation would need as well. And many of the features that we would need, we've been discussing for like 2.5 years. So this merely increases the priority of finally implementing those things.
Okay,
Yeah,
got it.
agree. This is the same stuff that I've been referring to when I've said, like, there are things we can do in the core that will serve our needs and be good for everybody else in the ecosystem.
Like, just as one example, if we want to hack a prototype, we wouldn't have to make changes to the core. We could do something like put a unsatisfiable node selector on a bunch of pods so that they don't schedule. You could have a controller come in from the side, match the pods against the label selector, and rewrite them to add the secret volumes or environment variables using the downward API or whatever we want, and remove the unsatisfiable node selector, and then they'll get scheduled and it'll all be good, right? So that will work. It's not very elegant. Well, it won't work with role-based access control enabled probably, but for sure it's not elegant. So we would want a more first-class, robust, easily discoverable, compatible with access control and all that kind of stuff solution. But the solution would not necessarily be specific to only service binding injection.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so just to say a few words on top of what Brian said, I hope that we will find specific issues, of which I think there are a set of known issues that are things that we want that can help us. I think it is incumbent upon us in the face-to-face to call those issues out probably up front and look for places where they fit in so that we can have specific things that we take away to say, okay, well, we think the priority of X, Y, and Z issue being implemented is probably high for us.
Yeah, and just to give you a tip, I've already started labeling old issues in the main repo with the service catalog label.
Yep.
You can actually start seeing which things I'm trying to keep track of as potential tools that we might use to implement some of this.
Cool. Thank you, Brian. Let's see.
All right, so
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to read 94. Were you going another direction?
I wasn't. I need to step away actually for a moment. I will be back.
Okay. So 94, as a user consuming a service instance via binding, I need to be able to understand the structure of the Kubernetes resources that are created when a new binding to a service instance is created so that I can configure my application appropriately. So I think to use the example, this would be the structure of the secret that is mounted at var run Kubernetes service binding / name.
So this is a follow-on to 81, basically?
Yeah. Or
Is
90?
this at the configuration level, for example, which secret you would reference, or also at the application level, like inside your application, you need to understand what the name, location, format, et cetera, of the data is so that you can ingest it into your application? And
Yeah, I think this is on the configuration side.
okay.
So it'd be the path. One of the aspects would be the path to the service binding, and then 2 would be the name of the file, perhaps in that directory, a la secret, and then perhaps the design of that data structure. Credentials will be in the credentials hash.
I'm not sure if I followed that, other than it's a follow-on or duplicate of 81, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
It sounds like it's an additional level of detail that needs to be understood compared to 81. I think this is something is going to be useful to surface it through the service broker as well. Like people are going to need to building things to consume the bindings are going to need to understand what the service broker returns for a given service instance, and we'll need some relatively automated way, I'm guessing, to translate the credentials returned into Kubernetes resources. So yeah, the users will need to be able to discover what are the properties that are being returned and how do they consume them. Ideally, that would be discoverable automatically somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sorry, the format of the binding that comes back from the service broker, is that what you're talking about, Brian?
Yeah.
Yeah, so on that for the Cloud Foundry, we've been pushing for all of those to be describable through schemas. So JSON schema is going to tell you what you get back from there, and then at least you will be able to understand what the heck you're supposed to be getting back.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, so that's both for the service instances on the way in, as well as on the out, aka what does it produce, the bindings, the format.
The parameters hash on the way in, and then the credentials hash on the way back out.
Yeah. Speaking of which,
yep.
Presumably one would need to provide those parameter values when creating an instance.
That's correct.
We didn't
And there's also
say that.
That's correct. And bindings can also take parameters.
Okay, so as a user for,
Can you give an example of a parameter that a binding might take, Delay?
Well,
Like some kind of handle or something?
well, it might be if, for example, you might have a way to go and control what kind of credential you want to get back in. So kind of like you can say, give me a size small, medium, large. You might be able to say, because the code has been written possibly being able to go and handle certain kind of connection or like use the credentials. So you might say, I need these kinds of credentials.
Okay, that makes sense.
Requesting service instances, and then we'll do that for binding to a service instance.
I'll call out, we are running over time. I think we're close enough to finished that I trust that anybody who needs to go will drop, and we can probably finish out the hour.
Consuming bound services.
Wait. You skipped 99. I didn't understand what 99 was.
Sorry. As a user, I want to be able to understand the relationship between a secret and a service instance so that I can properly configure my application. So I think this is the one where I deleted it from consuming bound service, but what the intent was that for some number of services that I request, I should be able to have a handle on it so that I can then look at the appropriate location for the credentials or the results of the binding. And the use case that this is around in more concrete terms would be I'm running a sharded are using a sharded Postgres database, and I need 5 Postgres databases, and I need to be able to address them concretely. So when I create a request for that, I can give it a name, and when it comes back, I can know that the results of that binding are in this secret with this name.
I'm not sure I understand. How is that different than the scenarios we talked about before, where when I ask for a binding, I get the secrets in a well-defined resource, and they appear. How is this any different?
I think that it may be the same thing.
Well, I guess the additional piece of information is you need to be able to bind to multiple, have multiple bindings to the same instance or multiple instances of the same class.
Or multiple bindings to different services that may present similar sets of things to
Different service instances, you mean?
Yes.
So yeah, let's capture that as some use cases then. You know, one app to many service instances, one app to many bindings to the same service instance. And I'd love for people to elaborate on the use cases for that last one.
I think there's a question of if you need different types of bindings to the same physical thing, would you represent that as 2 separate instances or as the same instance? So like if you create a database and it has the data port and an admin port or something like that, you know, how does that work? You can't really create 2 instances because those would be separate databases. So you have one binding to talk to both. Probably would not make sense for clients without admin privileges and things like that.
So I think that might be a case, like that specific case. I could see that being implemented a couple of different ways. You could get a secret that contained 2 sets of credentials if you have a differentiation of the admin credentials. You could get 2 secrets.
Well, so you're saying a single binding with a request saying these are the privileges I want, and then you get back multiple sets of credentials in return?
I think that's a third permutation. So I was coming at it from the standpoint of, though I think you're probably right, from the standpoint of I don't know anything. I want to use this thing, and I don't even know what I need. I might get back 2 sets of credentials.
And certainly it's the case. I mean, when we were designing the support for multiple ports and services, a bunch of use cases came up. It might be useful to revisit those use cases. But certainly any distributed application pretty much is going to have a client port and a peer port, and many other applications also have some kind of debug port or admin port. So that's at least 3 ports that would be on a large number of applications. And those ports are generally authorized differently, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes with firewalls and sometimes with app-level credentials. But you know, certainly there are distinct use cases where you would expect different. I guess in those use cases, you would expect a client to only access one of those ports at a time rather than multiple of them simultaneously. But maybe there's a use case where a single client would want to access multiple. I'm not sure.
And just to be clear, it also seems like you definitely want to go and have the case where you would not want all the applications to get all the credentials either, right? So like even in the case of like admin and like read-only access, you might not want to return. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding. Are you saying you always return all of everything's?
No, I'm definitely not saying that.
Okay, good.
I think one way to think about, at least the one way that I think about this, is that each of those facets of the service in Cloud Foundry terminology would be different plans, right? So you've got services, production database, and then plan as admin, plan as user, plan as read-only would be one way to approach that rather than...
But aren't those plans decided at when the service instance is created?
They can be. The thing is that in the Cloud Foundry thing, they have quite nebulous on it. So it could be that when you create a service instance, it could be that it actually provisions the database, and it creates the tables, and it creates everything else. They also say, but then some of that could be done at binding time. So it could be that you might have a database, and you get your own set of tables when you create a binding to it. We've been thinking that you might want to have multiple bindings to the same service instance, and they would be keyed off of a name. So you might have like a read only, and you might have like an admin. But
yeah. So additionally, there's also the in the Cloud Foundry model, services can be plan updatable, so that a service instance's plan can be updated after its provision.
Correct.
Adding another layer of complication and ambiguity.
Yeah, so anyway, it doesn't sound like plan is the right way to do this, but I like the database example. I think it's also true for a lot of storage systems. I could easily imagine when you bind, you get your own sandbox, like it creates a volume or a directory or something for you on the NFS server or Ceph cluster or something like that. So that would be a strong, compelling use case for multiple bindings if you actually needed different buckets to put data in.
So do we want to capture this in terms of support?
Multiple bindings to the same instance and yeah, from the same consumer, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. And then I think the other key bit is that difference of in the binding, there's a parameter that says this is an admin style binding, this is a read-only style binding, this is a...
Yes.
Can I call out in the name of making sure that we're using terminology correctly, line 105 I think should be service instance.
If possible, can people give some, add some text explaining the use cases for one app with multiple bindings to the same service instance, just so I can take that back to my team? Because I know, for example, Foundry does not support that today, and I'd like to try to convince them that they need to.
It seems like the easiest use case to think about this one that is either the database example, but even something like using like Google Cloud Storage, where you might have two kinds of credentials that you use for two different buckets, where you might be able to read from one bucket but not write to the other bucket.
Would they be the same? Would both buckets be in the same instance? You wouldn't have two different instances at that point?
There's only one cloud storage, right? Google Cloud Storage, for example.
Yeah, but you could also model that as two separate instances, right? Well, each bucket is a separate instance.
Yeah.
Yes, either way, I guess what I'm saying is that I could see both ways working. And it seems like unless there's a reason to go and force them to go and create two service instances, because I would err on the side of being able to go ahead and have that flexibility unless we need the rigidity.
I'm going to play the benevolent dictator card here as the owner of the Zoom meeting and call out. We have 2 minutes left before the hour. I don't think we're going to sort this out probably on this call. I move that we table this as something that needs further exploration and try to move on if there's any ground left to cover in the doc. I don't know what you guys did when I stepped out of the room.
Changed everything on you.
That would be okay.
It's totally different.
All suffering is attachment.
I think we've covered the ground for consuming bound services. I don't believe there's anything novel in this other than the question around network connectivity, which hasn't been directly addressed.
Yeah, I'm almost even willing to strike that for now if it serves exploration of the problem space, and we can have it later.
Okay. That is all connection detail stuff that can go. The question of adapting the credential to another format was something that people felt strongly about in the meeting on, Monday. Is this something that we want to carry over?
Yeah, let's keep that in there. What I would like to wind up with for this document is terse, like precise definitions of the use cases, and then a detailed examination of each of those, where we can put this kind of information. So I think this content that's on lines 110 through 113 is probably good contextual exploration of the problem space.
Okay. And then the life cycle of the service instance, these came as a service provider, I should be able to indicate that a service may be upgraded so that I can communicate service capabilities to end users. I think this was out of the plan updatable type thing.
Exactly, yeah.
This seems like they're not going to be able to solve this in a minute.
Yeah. Tell you what, we can end now, or we can give 5 minutes to validate whether these are use cases or not and be done with this thing. I would probably vote for the 5 minutes if everybody else is cool with it.
I'm going to have to drop, but you guys can continue without me.
Okay.
All right, so plan upgradable or updatable as a thing.
Yes, I think it's good.
Okay. As a, let's see, I need to be able to upgrade or downgrade that service instance. So that it makes sense.
Sorry, so I upgraded. So in Cloud Foundry, the upgrading means you can switch the plan type. That is the only thing you can upgrade as far as I understand. So for example, I cannot go back in and say, please update with one particular property of an existing service. So if we are saying you can update a service or upgrade a service from one plan to another, or are we saying you can also update the
parameters,
properties of an existing service? Because I think they are different, at least in the Cloud Foundry model.
Yeah, I think this is the. Paul, correct me if I'm wrong. This was aimed toward the plan.
This was about plan updatable, yeah. So the first one is, I need to know that thing is plan updatable.
Yes.
The second one is, if it is, I need to be able to do it.
Yes. And the canonical use case for this is hey, I started using on the free plan and I actually found some value in it, so let me give you some money so you can get rich. And I can.
Yeah. Let me propose the alternate canonical use case of Hacker News moved on and now I need to go back to the free tier.
Hey man, success only happens in one direction, right?
That's right.
That's what I'm saying. You never go back. Okay, so let's see. So that's
yeah. So then 122 is what is the update story for bindings to a service instance, and we put this here because it is not talked about at all in the context of Cloud Foundry.
Yeah. I've looked and I haven't found any kind of documentation about key rotation, but I'm in no way a Cloud Foundry expert. I would love to be wrong and say and find out that there's some like nook or cranny of documentation that I didn't probe.
I think I threw this in for key rotation, but I didn't know if it also applied to the IP address of the endpoint updating.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't even know if that's a thing. Like, I sort of imagine this as being something that, like, if you're going to provide an endpoint, it's incumbent upon you to provide either a DNS name to resolve to a stable network endpoint or a virtual IP. Like, worst case scenario, I think virtual IP is extremely undesirable compared to DNS, but that's how I see that being handled.
But I think if we can basically say the assumption is that it should be a stable endpoint. right, for a capital service. That seems pretty sane assumption to me.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. For a service, I think this 124 one is more along the lines of the catalog. Question mark? No, it isn't. It's about the actual service instance.
Yeah, so this is about like what is the update story when you have a service that has instances created of it. Someone calls the broker's catalog endpoint again in the Cloud Foundry model and slurps in the new service definitions. What happens to the existing service instances? Are they updated? What happens, right?
Yeah.
And they have a pretty, I think they have a pretty detailed model of those in their docs of sort of kind of what happens to existing service instances and so forth.
Yeah.
Or at least what should happen.
I do recall orphaned or abandoned services showing up in that documentation. So
Yeah, so if you delete a service, the service instances are orphaned.
yeah.
I think that might make sense. I think we should decide for ourselves whether it does. So I will say though, like we're 15 minutes over the time that we had allotted for this. I think we are in a good state now, and I'm see my trigger finger? It's itching to hit the merge button on this thing. So I am comfortable calling it here, and we can further refine this in subsequent pull requests if everybody else who remains on the call, the current seat of power in Kubernetes SIG Service Catalog is okay with that.
I think it's great, and I also would like to say that I think this format was very superior to trying to wade through the comments on the GitHub and
Yes.
trying to have those conversations. So if we can find a way to go ahead and replicate this experience moving forward, I think at least I found this to be super helpful.
So this is going to be, the face-to-face is going to be this convenient, like times 10. Bill, are you going to be at the face-to-face?
In Boulder?
Yeah.
Yep. I'll be there
Awesome.
Tuesday evening. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yes.
Cool. So the few action items that I gathered, I'm going to go ahead and run through this again. We've got a bunch of to-dos. I'll expand that a little bit, expand the things there. I will start the noun extraction into a glossary, and then once that noun extraction has happened, then I'll scrub all of the use cases for consistency. And then we've got the actor fix-up thing. We can do that on a follow-on PR. And that's it.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for playing along today, Jason.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thanks to you both for putting this together. The doc is much clearer state as far as I'm concerned. So thank you.
Good use cases are their own reward.
Yes. All right. Is the next one then in Boulder face-to-face, or are we going to have other meetings, or do we think that we are in good state and we'll see you next week, or?
Very good question. So I would really like to meet again before then. I know that Friday afternoon is probably a time when a lot of people like that have families have like trick or treat for kids and stuff like that, and offices or other occasions to go to. I do not have for sure availability tomorrow afternoon, and my Thursdays are ordinarily like a 5-hour endurance testing consecutive contiguous block of meetings. So my availability is not tremendous tomorrow. So I think we may be where we're at, which is what it is.
No, I think it's great. I mean, I feel like a lot of progress has been made basically this week, kind of stepping back and re-looking at like, okay, what are we doing and so forth. And I think that's going to be really teeing it up very nicely for next week's discussions.
Yeah, I hope so. I would like to continue talking about the production end of things. If we were to meet again, I would say, let's table all this and let's talk about sharing services across Kubernetes namespaces in the context of what is that experience like. I think that's something that's really important to adoption of Kubernetes. There's probably a few different permutations, of course, but we'll see if that's possible. Would you like to start a mailing list thread about that and see if people have availability? For all we know, everybody's like, yeah, Friday afternoon, let's do it. We'll see.
I'd be more than happy to go and send a note there saying if there's any further discussions that we want to have and what the availability is and go from there. No worries.
Okay, awesome.
Super.
All right, I'm going to stop recording and